Sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Sometimes the home you built with your own hands becomes the place you can't stay. Jedediah Boone learned both truths on a snowy Montana night when he heard his nephew talking about getting rid of the old man. They thought Uncle Jed was just a burden now, someone who'd outlived his usefulness on the family ranch. They were wrong. Boone packed his duffel bag, called his German shepherd, and walked out into that storm without saying goodbye. What his family didn't know was what else Uncle Jed was carrying in that old bag. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Boone Ranch had been carved from wild Montana territory by hands that knew the meaning of honest work. 3 generations of sweat, blood, and determination had transformed 8,000 acres of raw wilderness into something that mattered, a place where cattle grazed fat in summer, meadows and horses ran free across rolling hills that stretched toward the Rockies like God's own. Promise of something greater. Jedediah Boone had built most of it himself. At 72, his hands still bore the calluses of a man who'd never shied away from hard labor. Deep lines mapped his weathered face like the creek beds that cut through his land, each one telling a story of seasons weathered, storms survived, and losses endured with the quiet dignity that comes from understanding life's true weight. The old man had arrived at the ranch 47 years ago, fresh from a war nobody talked about much anymore. Vietnam had left its marks on him, some visible, others buried so deep they only surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. His brother Samuel had offered him work and a place to heal, and Jed had accepted both with the grateful silence of a man who understood second chances. Samuel was gone now, buried beneath the old oak that shaded the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the main house. His wife Martha had followed him 6 years later, and their son Thomas had inherited everything: the land, the cattle, the responsibility, and the burden of keeping the family legacy alive. But Thomas lacked his father's vision and his mother's heart. Where Samuel had seen opportunity in every sunrise, Thomas saw only obligation. Where Martha had found joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life, Thomas found tedium. The main house sat at the heart of the property like a fortress built from local stone and hand-hewn timber. Jed had laid every stone in that foundation, cut every beam that held up the roof, and installed every window that now glowed warm against the gathering dusk. The wraparound porch faced west, offering a view of the mountains that never failed to remind a man of his proper place in the grand scheme of things. Behind the main house, a cluster of smaller buildings formed the working heart of the ranch. The barn Jed had built could shelter 60 head of cattle during the worst winter storms. The machine shop contained tools accumulated over decades, some bought, some made, all maintained with the meticulous care of a man who understood that broken equipment meant broken dreams. The bunkhouse had housed countless ranch hands over the years, young men mostly, drawn by the promise of honest work and the chance to learn from Jedediah Boone, whose reputation as a cattleman stretched across 3 counties. Thomas lived in the main house now with his wife Carol and their 2 teenage children. But tonight, Jed had watched through the kitchen window as his nephew's family sat around the dining table he'd built with his own hands, talking in low voices about matters that didn't include him. The conversation had drifted through the thin walls of his small cabin like smoke, carrying words that cut deeper than any blade. The cabin where Jed made his home sat 50 yards from the main house, close enough to be convenient, but far enough to offer privacy. He'd built it too, designed it as a simple but comfortable retreat where an old man could live out his days with dignity. 2 rooms, a small kitchen and a bathroom, everything a person needed. Nothing they didn't. The wood stove in the center kept it warm through the harshest winters, and the south-facing windows let in enough light to read by during the long mountain afternoons. His German shepherd, Bear, lay on the braided rug beside the stove, golden eyes tracking every movement his master made. The dog had been with him for 8 years now, a companion whose loyalty had never wavered and whose judgment Jed trusted more than most humans he'd known. Bear understood the rhythms of ranch life, the subtle changes in weather that meant trouble coming, and the moods of the cattle better than some cowboys who'd worked with livestock all their lives. Tonight, something had changed in the rhythm of the place. Bear had sensed it first, raising his head from his paws with the alertness of an animal that understood danger long before humans recognized its approach. The dog's instincts had been proven right when Thomas's voice carried across the yard, cold and calculating as he discussed his uncle's future with the casual indifference reserved for unwanted livestock. The old leather duffel bag sat on Jed's narrow bed, its brass buckles dulled by time but still functional. He'd carried that bag through jungles where every shadow might hide death, across desert sands that swallowed men whole, and into mountain passes where the air grew so thin that breathing became a conscious act of will. Inside its worn canvas depths lay items most people would never understand, tools of a trade he'd mastered long before. He'd learned to gentle horses or read the subtle signs that told a rancher when calving season was about to begin. The medals were there too, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them through 4 decades of careful storage. Bronze star, silver star, purple heart, pieces of metal that represented moments when ordinary men had been asked to do extraordinary things and somehow found the strength to answer that call. But the medals weren't what mattered. What mattered were the skills those moments had taught him, the knowledge that had kept him alive when younger, stronger. Supposedly better men had fallen around him like leaves in an autumn storm. Thomas had made his position clear tonight. Uncle Jed was a burden, an old man who consumed resources without producing sufficient value to justify his continued presence. The family needed to make practical decisions about the ranch's future, and sentiment couldn't be allowed to cloud their judgment. Carol had agreed, adding that her children deserved better than having to care for an aging relative who contributed nothing meaningful. To their lives, they discussed nursing homes, with the detached efficiency of people pricing livestock. They'd calculated costs and benefits, weighed options, and reached conclusions that treated Jedediah Boone as a problem to be solved rather than a man who'd given everything. He had to build what they now considered theirs by right of inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come home from war carrying skills that could kill, but had chosen instead to build. He'd spent nearly half a century creating something beautiful and lasting, something that would endure long after he was gone. And now the beneficiaries of his labor had decided he was worth less than the cattle he'd raised, the horses he'd trained, or the land he'd improved with his own sweat and sacrifice. But Jedediah Boone hadn't survived 3 tours in Southeast Asia by accepting other people's judgments about his worth. He hadn't built a ranch from nothing by giving up when circumstances turned difficult. And he wasn't about to start now at 72 just because his own blood had forgotten the meaning of loyalty. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes drifting past his window like pieces of torn sky. The weather service had predicted 6 inches, but Jed could read the signs better than any meteorologist. This storm had teeth. By morning, the roads would be impassable and the world would be transformed into something clean and white and new. Perfect traveling weather for a man who knew how to move unseen through hostile territory. Perfect cover for someone who understood that sometimes the best response to betrayal was simply to disappear, taking with him everything the betrayers had never bothered to value or understand. Bear raised his head as Jed reached for the duffel bag, ember eyes reflecting the lamplight like captured flames. The dog knew something was happening, could sense the change in his master's energy and purpose. There would be travel ahead, uncertainty, and perhaps danger, but there would also be freedom from people who measured worth in dollars and saw burden where they should have seen blessing. Jed strapped on the shoulder holster he hadn't worn in 15 years. Feeling its familiar weight settle against his ribs like an old friend returning home. The Colt 45 nestled there had never let him down, and he suspected it wouldn't start now. He pulled on the heavy coat Martha had given him for his 60th birthday, its pockets deep enough to hold what a man might need when the world turned cold and unfriendly. The last thing he packed was a photograph. Samuel and Martha on their wedding day, young and full of hope and promise. They'd believed in something bigger than themselves, had built something that would outlast their own brief time on earth. Their son had inherited their creation, but not their vision, their property, but not their purpose. That was Thomas's loss. Some gifts, once rejected, never came again. The conversation that changed everything had started innocently enough. Jed had been returning from the barn after checking on a pregnant mare when he'd seen the light still burning in the main house kitchen. The late hour struck him as odd. Thomas and Carol were early-to-bed people, creatures of habit who rarely deviated from their evening routine of television and early sleep. He'd approached the house with the quiet footsteps of a man who'd learned stealth in places where noise meant death, not from any sense of espionage, but simply because 47 years of ranch life had taught him to move carefully around buildings at night. Leaping horses and cattle could spook easily, and a wise man avoided unnecessary disturbances. The kitchen window had been cracked open despite the cold. Carol's attempt to clear the lingering smell of burned dinner. Their voices had carried clearly through the gap, intimate and unguarded in the way people spoke when they believed themselves alone. "We can't keep supporting him indefinitely," Thomas had been saying, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who'd rehearsed his arguments many times. "He's 72 years old, Carol. He should be in a facility where they can properly care for him." "I know you feel guilty about it," Carol had replied, her voice softer but no less determined. "But practical decisions aren't about guilt. They're about what's best for everyone, including him." Jed had frozen in place, his hands still resting on the porch railing he'd installed 20 years earlier. The wood was smooth beneath his palm, worn by countless touches and countless seasons. He'd sanded and stained every board, driven every nail with his own hands. The irony of gripping something he'd created while listening to his eviction notice wasn't lost on him. "The kids are getting older," Thomas had continued. "College expenses are coming. We need to think about their future, not just Uncle Jed's comfort. This ranch could support a lot more cattle if we converted his cabin into equipment storage. Have you looked into facilities?" Carol had asked, her tone suggesting she'd already done research of her own. "Meadowbrook Manor has an opening. It's not cheap, but they take Medicare and there's a waiting list. If we're going to do this, we need to move soon." Jed had heard the rustle of papers, official documents being shuffled across the table he'd built from planks salvaged from an old barn. The sound had reminded him of military briefings, officers discussing troop movements and casualty reports with the same dispassionate efficiency his nephew now applied to disposing of an unwanted relative. What about all his things? Carol had wondered. That cabin is full of old junk. Military stuff, tools, photographs. What do we do with 47 years of accumulated clutter? "Most of it can go to Goodwill," Thomas had said with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never understood the weight of memory. "The tools might be worth something at auction. The military stuff..." He'd paused, and Jed had heard the sound of liquid being poured, probably coffee from the pot he'd helped Martha pick out during a trip to town 15 years ago. "Who knows what that's worth? Some of it looks pretty old. When would you tell him?" Carol had asked. "After the holidays. No point in ruining Christmas for the kids. We'll present it as a positive thing, better medical care, social interaction with people his own age, relief from the burden of maintaining his own living space." The burden of maintaining his own living space. Jed had almost smiled at that. The cabin that required less maintenance than any structure on the property, because it had been built by someone who understood that good work lasted. The living space he'd designed for maximum efficiency and minimum fuss, where everything had its place and purpose. "He won't take it well," Carol had observed. "He'll adjust. Old people are more resilient than we give them credit for. And honestly, he's been getting more isolated lately. Less sociable. Sometimes I catch him just staring off at the mountains like he's not really here. Those mountain stares weren't absence, Jed had wanted to tell them. They were presence, deep, careful attention to the land that had shaped him, the peaks that had witnessed his transformation from damaged soldier to accomplished rancher. The mountains held stories Thomas had never bothered to learn, lessons about endurance and adaptation that his nephew desperately needed but would never seek. What if he refuses to go? Carol had asked. Then we'll have to make some hard choices about his living arrangement here. We can't force him into care, but we don't have to make his staying comfortable either. That sentence had hit Jed like a physical blow. The casual cruelty of it, the cold calculation behind words that treated him like a tenant who could be pressured into leaving rather than family who deserved basic respect. He'd built everything they took for granted, and they were discussing making his life uncomfortable enough to drive him away. The kids don't need to see any unpleasantness, Thomas had continued. If Uncle Jed chooses to be difficult, we'll handle it privately. Bear had sensed his master's distress, moving quietly to Jed's side, with the intuitive understanding that had made him such a valuable companion. The dog's presence had been steadying, a reminder that loyalty still existed, even if it came with 4 legs and a tail, rather than shared blood and family name. I'll call Meadowbrook tomorrow, Carol had decided. Get the paperwork started. The sooner we begin the process, the sooner we can resolve this situation. Jed had been reduced to a situation that needed resolving, a problem that required management. Not a man who'd given his best years to building something lasting, not family who deserved consideration and respect, but a complication in their plans for a more prosperous future. He'd heard chairs scraping against the floor, the sounds of people preparing to end their evening. Time to move, to retreat to his cabin before they discovered his inadvertent eavesdropping. But as he'd turned away from the window, one final exchange had stopped him cold. You know, Thomas had said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been genuine reflection. Sometimes I wonder what he did in the war. He never talks about it, but some of that military gear in his cabin looks pretty specialized. Not standard infantry stuff. Does it matter? Carol had replied with characteristic pragmatism. Whatever he did then, he's just an old rancher now. And old ranchers don't need tactical equipment or combat boots that still look like they could march through hell. If only she knew, Jed had thought, as he'd finally moved away from the window. If only either of them understood that some skills never faded, some training never left you, and some old soldiers never really stopped being soldiers. They just found new battles to fight and new ways to serve. The walk back to his cabin had felt like a journey through hostile territory. Every familiar landmark suddenly strange and unwelcoming. The barn he'd built now seemed like a monument to wasted effort. The pastures he'd fenced appeared to mock his decades of careful stewardship. Even the mountains looked different, less like guardians and more like witnesses to his foolish belief that family meant something beyond shared genetics and inheritance claims. Inside his cabin, Jed had sat heavily in the chair beside his wood stove, Bear settling at his feet with a soft whine of concern. The dog knew something was wrong, could sense the seismic shift in his master's emotional landscape. Animals understood betrayal in ways that cut deeper than human comprehension, felt the sting of broken loyalty as a physical wound. The old duffel bag had seemed to call to him from its place in the bedroom closet, reminding him of possibilities he'd set aside long ago. Inside that worn canvas lay proof that Jedediah Boone had been someone before he'd become Uncle Jed, had possessed skills and knowledge that might prove useful again if circumstances required their application. He'd spent 47 years trying to be the man Samuel and Martha had believed he could become, builder instead of destroyer, protector instead of predator, creator of lasting beauty rather than architect of necessary violence. But their son had never understood the gift he'd been given, never recognized the sacrifice involved in choosing construction over destruction. Now Thomas and Carol wanted to warehouse him like obsolete equipment, dispose of him like livestock that had outlived its productive years. They'd made their choice with cold calculation and careful planning. Perhaps it was time for Jedediah Boone to remember that choice worked both ways, and some decisions carried consequences their makers never anticipated. The storm outside was intensifying. Wind driving snow against his windows with increasing force. Perfect weather for new beginnings, for departures that left no tracks and arrivals that no one would expect. Perfect conditions for reminding certain people that underestimating Jedediah Boone had always been a dangerous mistake. Even when he'd chosen to let them make it safely, Bear lifted his head as Jed rose from his chair and moved toward the bedroom. Amber eyes reflecting understanding that transcended species barriers. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together, an old soldier and his faithful companion, bound by loyalty that no amount of family betrayal could break. The time for building was over. The time for leaving had begun. And sometimes, when you'd given everything to people who valued nothing, leaving was the kindest gift you could offer, both to them and to yourself. The hours between midnight and dawn had always belonged to Jedediah Boone. In Vietnam, they'd called it the killing time, when Charlie moved through the jungle like shadows, given malevolent purpose. When good soldiers died because they'd relaxed their vigilance for 30 seconds too long. Later, during his ranch years, those same hours had become sanctuary, time for reflection, planning, and the quiet satisfaction that came from checking on animals that depended on his care. Tonight, they served a different purpose entirely. Jed moved through his cabin with practiced efficiency, selecting items with the careful consideration of a man who understood that every ounce mattered when you were traveling light and traveling far. The duffel bag lay open on his bed like a patient receptacle for the tools of a life most people could never imagine. The Randall knife went in first, its 7-inch blade still sharp enough to shave with, despite 4 decades of careful storage. He'd carried that knife through 18 months of operations that officially never happened, had used it for everything from cutting C-ration cans to purposes he preferred not to remember. The leather sheath was worn smooth by countless hours of handling, shaped by his grip until it felt like an extension of his own hand. Next came the compass, not the kind you'd find in a sporting goods store, but a military-grade instrument designed to function accurately under conditions that would destroy lesser equipment. Waterproof, shock-resistant, and calibrated to a precision that could mean the difference between reaching your objective and wandering lost until the enemy found you. Jed had used it to navigate terrain where GPS satellites couldn't penetrate jungle canopy, where magnetic declination calculations meant survival or death. The binoculars followed, compact but powerful enough to identify threats at distances that gave you time to respond appropriately. Night vision capability, range-finding reticles, and constructions sturdy enough to survive being dropped from a helicopter or used as an improvised weapon if circumstances required. They'd served him well in places where seeing first meant living to see another day. Bear watched these preparations with alert interest, head tilted in the questioning pose that indicated deep canine thought. The dog understood that significant change was coming, could sense the purposeful energy that surrounded his master's movements. This wasn't the casual packing of a man going to town for supplies. This was preparation for something bigger, more permanent, more dangerous. "We're leaving, old friend," Jed said quietly, running his hand through the shepherd's thick coat. "Going somewhere they can't find us, can't hurt us, can't treat us like worn-out equipment waiting for disposal." The cash came next. 47 years of careful saving, money accumulated through decades of simple living and modest needs. Bills wrapped in waterproof packets, denominations small enough to avoid drawing attention but sufficient to support 2 travelers for months if spent carefully. Banks left records, credit cards created trails, but cash was anonymous and untraceable, currency for people who needed to disappear completely. His military records joined the growing pile, documents that told a story Thomas and Carol would never understand. Commendations for actions that remained classified, service records that hinted at operations conducted in shadows deeper than official acknowledgement. Purple Heart citation for wounds received during a mission that didn't exist. Bronze Star for valor displayed in a battle that never appeared in any history book. The medals themselves seemed almost insignificant compared to the knowledge they represented. Skills burned into muscle memory through training so intense it bordered on torture. Tactics learned in classrooms where failure meant death rather than poor grades. Close quarters combat, demolitions, surveillance, survival techniques designed to keep you alive when the entire world wanted you dead. Jed had spent nearly 5 decades trying to forget those lessons, building a life that celebrated creation rather than destruction. But knowledge once gained couldn't be erased, and skills once mastered never truly faded. They simply waited, patient and ready, for circumstances that might require their application. The small radio was military surplus too, but more recent vintage, purchased years ago when he'd realized that isolated ranchers needed reliable communication equipment, multiband capability, encrypted channels, and range sufficient to reach emergency services even from the most remote locations. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose, allowing him to monitor law enforcement frequencies and stay ahead of any search efforts his family might eventually organize. Thomas and Carol would notice his absence eventually, probably not until late afternoon, when he failed to appear for his usual evening check of the livestock. They'd assume he was sulking about something, hiding in his cabin like a wounded animal, licking its pride. By the time they actually investigated, the storm would have erased all traces of his departure, leaving nothing but questions. They lacked the imagination to answer correctly. The thought of their confusion brought him no satisfaction. Jed had never been a man who took pleasure in others' distress, even when they'd earned it through their own choices. But he felt no guilt either. They'd made their decision about his worth and his future. Now he was making his own decision about where and how he'd spend whatever years remained to him. A photograph went into the bag next. Not the wedding picture of Samuel and Martha, but an older image that showed 4 young soldiers standing beside a helicopter in a clearing that couldn't be identified from any official map. Jed was the second from the left, 25 years old and lean as a whip, eyes already holding the 1,000-yard stare that marked men who'd seen too much too young. The other 3 were gone now, killed in action during operations that would never be declassified. Their sacrifice unacknowledged by a government that couldn't admit they'd ever existed. But Jed remembered them, carried their memory like a sacred trust that connected him to a brotherhood deeper than blood, stronger than family ties, more enduring than promises made by people who'd never faced life or death decisions in the space between heartbeats. His medical kit was professional grade, stocked with supplies that went far beyond basic first aid. Combat medicine, trauma surgery, pharmaceuticals that required special licenses to possess legally. He'd maintained the kit meticulously over the years, updating medications before they expired, replacing equipment as new technology became available. A ranch could be a dangerous place, and help was often hours away from remote locations. The kit had saved lives over the years, ranch hands injured by equipment, neighbors hurt during storms when normal medical services couldn't reach them, animals that needed emergency care beyond standard veterinary procedures. But its original purpose had been different, designed to keep soldiers alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities or die with dignity when such facilities weren't available. Maps came next, topographical surveys of terrain that stretched from Montana to Mexico, detailed enough to show every trail, every water source, every shelter that might mean survival for travelers who needed to avoid main roads and official attention. Jed had studied this terrain for decades, hiking sections during his rare vacations, memorizing landmarks and alternative routes with the thoroughness of a man who understood that knowledge was the most portable form of security. The high-powered flashlight was military specification too, waterproof and shock-resistant with enough candle power to temporarily blind an attacker or signal for help across vast distances. Red filter for preserving night vision, strobe setting for emergency situations, and battery life measured in weeks rather than hours. Tools for people who might need to operate in darkness, where failure meant death. Bear moved closer as Jed continued his methodical packing, pressing against his master's leg with the solid warmth that had comforted them both through countless cold nights and difficult days. The dog sensed the importance of these preparations, understood that everything was changing in ways that couldn't be reversed or regretted. "You're all the family I need now," Jed told him, scratching behind the pointed ears that swiveled toward every sound in the night. "Just you and me against whatever comes next. Think we can handle it." Bear's tail moved once, a subtle gesture that conveyed more loyalty and understanding than 47 years of family membership had ever produced. Dogs didn't calculate your worth based on productivity or convenience. They didn't warehouse you when you became inconvenient or dispose of you when you outlived your usefulness. They simply loved you with the uncomplicated devotion that humans talked about but rarely practiced. The storm was reaching its peak intensity now. Wind howling around the cabin with the voice of something wild and untamed. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that would make travel impossible for ordinary people using conventional transportation. But Jed had never been ordinary people, and his transportation needs had been calculated with different parameters in mind. By dawn, the world would be transformed, clean, white, and unmarked by human passage. Perfect conditions for new beginnings, fresh starts, and journeys that left no trace for those who might follow. Perfect weather for reminding certain people that Jedediah Boone had always been more than they'd bothered to understand, and that underestimating him had consequences they'd never considered. The last items went into the duffel bag with the finality of decisions that couldn't be undone. Everything else, the furniture he'd built, the tools he'd collected, the photographs that documented nearly 5 decades of life in one place, would remain behind like artifacts of a man who'd ceased to exist at midnight on a snowy Montana night. Thomas and Carol could sort through the remnants of Uncle Jed's life, puzzle over equipment they didn't recognize, wonder about stories they'd never bothered to hear. They'd inherit everything except the only thing that truly mattered, the man who'd created it all with his own hands and his own vision of what family should mean. That man was leaving with the storm, taking nothing but what he'd brought to the ranch originally and what he'd learned during his years of trying to be someone worthy of Samuel and Martha's faith. The rest belonged to a life that had ended the moment he'd heard his own family discussing his disposal with the casual efficiency of people pricing livestock. The departure itself was a study in precision timing and careful planning. Jed had learned long ago that successful operations depended more on preparation than courage, more on thinking 3 steps ahead than reacting to immediate circumstances. Tonight's mission, because that's how his mind automatically categorized it, required the same methodical approach that had kept him alive through conflicts. Most people didn't know America had ever fought. He waited until 3:17 a.m., the deepest part of the night when human beings naturally slept most soundly. Circadian rhythms and evolutionary programming conspired to make this the time when guards dozed at their posts, when sentries relaxed their vigilance, when even the most alert individuals succumbed to the biological imperative for rest. Thomas and Carol would be in their deepest sleep now, unlikely to wake unless something significant disturbed their suburban-in-the-mountains routine. The storm provided perfect cover, its howling wind masking any sounds that might carry across the 50 yards between his cabin and the main house. Snow fell so heavily that visibility extended no more than a few feet, creating a white curtain that would hide movement even if someone happened to glance out a window. Weather conditions that would challenge most travelers were ideal for someone who understood how to use environmental factors as tactical advantages. Bear moved beside him like a ghost, paused silent on snow that crunched under Jed's boots despite his efforts at stealth. The dog had learned silence during years of accompanying his master on pre-dawn checks of the livestock, understanding instinctively when situations required quiet movement and careful observation. Tonight, he seemed to sense something even more significant than their usual early morning routines. The snowshoes had been stored in the cabin's small utility closet for 15 years, waiting for winters severe enough to require their use around the ranch. Tonight they served a different purpose, distributing Jed's weight across the snow's surface and leaving tracks that would be filled and obliterated by continuing snowfall long before anyone thought to look for them. By morning his passage would be invisible, his direction unknowable, his destination impossible to determine from physical evidence. Jed had chosen his route during countless walks across the ranch over the years, mapping terrain with the unconscious thoroughness of a man whose life had once depended on knowing every possible escape route from any given position. The path he followed now avoided open areas where tracks might be preserved by wind patterns, skirted the main buildings where motion sensor lights might activate, and led toward the high country where few people ventured even in good weather. The first objective was the ridgeline that marked the northern boundary of the ranch property. From there, he could access old mining roads that wound through the mountains like arteries connecting ghost towns and abandoned claims. These roads appeared on few maps and were known mainly to hunters, prospectors, and people who preferred travel routes that didn't require interaction with official authorities. The duffel bag rode easily on his shoulders, its weight distributed by straps that had been designed for long-distance travel under combat conditions. 47 pounds of carefully selected equipment and supplies, everything a man needed to disappear completely and survive, indefinitely in terrain that would challenge most people even with full support and preparation. Bears. Breathing created small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the cold air. His thick coat providing insulation that made him comfortable in conditions that would kill less hardy animals within hours. German shepherds had been bred for harsh climates and demanding work, characteristics that made them ideal companions for people whose lives involved hardship and uncertainty. The old mining road appeared exactly where Jed's memory had placed it, a narrow track that switchbacked up the mountainside through stands of pine and aspen that stood like silent witnesses to his passage. Snow had drifted across the road in places, but the grade remained manageable for someone in good physical condition who understood proper pacing for high-altitude travel. 3 miles from the ranch, Jed stopped to rest and check his back trail. The storm had intensified rather than diminished, wind driving snow in sheets that reduced visibility to arm's length. No tracks remained of his passage, no sign that 2 figures had passed this way in the night. Even thermal imaging would be useless in these conditions, heat signatures dissipated by wind and concealed by falling snow. Bear settled beside him, tongue lolling despite the cold air. The dog was in excellent condition, accustomed to long hikes across challenging terrain, but even he needed periodic rest during extended travel. Jed used the brake to consult his compass and confirm their heading, calculating distances and timing with the methodical precision of someone who understood that navigation errors in this country could prove fatal. The military radio crackled softly when he activated it, scanning frequencies that would carry any traffic related to missing persons or search operations. Nothing but routine dispatcher chatter and weather updates that confirmed what he could see with his own eyes. The storm was expected to continue through dawn and into the following afternoon, dumping snow measured in feet rather than inches. Perfect. By the time anyone realized Jedediah Boone was missing, the weather would have eliminated all evidence of his departure route and direction. Search teams would waste valuable time checking obvious destinations, nearby towns, hospitals, relatives in distant states. They'd never imagined that Uncle Jed had simply walked away into the wilderness with nothing but what he could carry, heading for destinations that existed on no tourist maps and offered no amenities beyond what a man could provide for himself. The mining road continued, upward through terrain that grew progressively more challenging, demanding careful foot placement and constant attention to changing conditions. Ice formed where snowmelt had frozen, creating treacherous surfaces that could send an unwary traveler tumbling down slopes that dropped hundreds of feet into darkness. But Jed had navigated worse terrain under more dangerous circumstances, had learned to read rock and snow and weather with the fluency of someone whose survival had depended on such knowledge. At 5,000 feet elevation, the trees began to thin, and the landscape opened into high meadows that would be carpeted with wildflowers during summer months. Now they lay buried under snow that would persist until late spring, transformed into a white wasteland that offered little shelter but magnificent views of the valleys below. On clear days, you could see for 50 miles from this elevation, watch weather systems develop and track their progress across terrain that stretched to the horizon. Tonight, visibility extended no more than a few yards in any direction, the world reduced to the small circle of snow illuminated by his flashlight. But Jed didn't need to see distant landmarks to know his position. Years of hiking these mountains had burned the terrain into his memory with the precision of a topographical map. Each ridge and valley as familiar as the rooms of his own cabin. Bear moved closer as they climbed higher, seeking the warmth that came from proximity to his master's body heat. The dog's thick coat provided excellent insulation, but prolonged exposure to wind-driven snow could challenge even his hardy constitution. Jed knew they'd need shelter soon, somewhere to rest and warm themselves before continuing their journey into increasingly hostile terrain. The abandoned mine shaft appeared exactly where his memory had placed it, a dark opening in the mountainside that offered protection from wind and weather. Jed had discovered it years earlier during a hunting trip, had noted its location and potential usefulness with the automatic assessment of someone trained to identify tactical advantages in any environment. The shaft extended only 30 feet into the mountainside before ending in a wall of collapsed rock. But the entrance provided a natural windbreak, and the interior temperature remained significantly warmer than outside air. Previous travelers had left evidence of their passage: fire-blackened stones arranged in a circle, scraps of wood that could be used for fuel, even a few canned goods left by hunters or prospectors who'd used the shelter during storms. Jed gathered deadfall from the surrounding forest, dry wood that had been seasoned by years of mountain weather. A small fire would provide warmth without creating enough smoke to attract attention, its light invisible from the outside due to the shaft's configuration. He'd learned to build fires that served their purpose without revealing position, another skill from a past life that proved useful in circumstances its original instructors had never anticipated. Bear settled beside the growing flames with a contented sigh, golden eyes reflecting firelight as he watched his master's methodical preparations for an extended stay. The dog understood that they'd reached a temporary sanctuary, a place where rest was possible and danger temporarily reduced. His relaxed posture indicated trust in his master's judgment and confidence in their shared ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The warmth felt good after hours of travel through sub-zero temperatures, circulation returning to fingers and toes that had grown numb despite insulated gloves and boots. Jed prepared a simple meal from military rations that provided maximum nutrition with minimum weight and preparation requirements. Food designed for people who might need to eat quickly and quietly while remaining alert for threats that could materialize without warning. Thomas and Carol would wake in a few hours to discover that Uncle Jed's cabin was empty, his bed unslept in, his morning routine disrupted for the first time in 47 years. They'd probably assume he'd gone to town early for supplies, wouldn't begin to worry until afternoon, when he failed to return for his usual evening duties. By then, Jed would be 20 miles deeper into the mountains, following routes that would challenge experienced backpackers even in good weather. He'd be beyond the reach of casual search efforts, beyond the jurisdiction of local law enforcement. beyond the influence of family members who decided his life had lost its value. The fire crackled softly as snow continued to fall outside their shelter, each flake adding to the accumulation that would soon make travel impossible for anyone using conventional vehicles or lacking specialized equipment. But Jed had spent his adult life preparing for situations others couldn't imagine, accumulating skills and knowledge that most people never needed, but some people couldn't survive without. Tonight, those preparations would begin paying dividends in ways Thomas and Carol could never understand. Their practical decision to dispose of an inconvenient relative had freed something they'd never bothered to recognize. A man whose capabilities extended far beyond building barns and raising cattle, whose loyalty had been the only thing restraining skills that few people possessed, and fewer still had ever been forced to use. Uncle Jed was gone forever, disappeared into a storm that had erased all evidence of his existence. What remained was Jedediah Boone, soldier, survivor, and man whose family had just learned the hard way that some decisions carried consequences no amount of planning could anticipate. Dawn came slowly to the high country, filtered through clouds that pressed low against the mountainsides, like grey wool stretched too thin. The storm had passed during the early morning hours, leaving behind a transformed landscape where familiar landmarks lay buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, and the world stretched white and pristine in every direction. Jed woke to Bear's low whine, the dog's internal clock more reliable than any timepiece manufactured by human hands. 6:30 a.m. Time to be moving if they wanted to cover significant distance before the sun climbed high enough to create glare conditions that could blind a traveler on snow-covered terrain. He learned long ago that successful operations required early starts and careful attention to environmental factors that could turn from advantage to liability without warning. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, providing just enough warmth to keep their shelter comfortable without wasting fuel that might be needed later. Jed stirred the embers back to life, heating water for coffee that would provide both warmth and the caffeine necessary for alertness during challenging travel. Military habits died hard, and hot coffee had been the foundation of every successful mission he'd ever undertaken. Bear stretched with the elaborate ritual that marked a dog's transition from sleep to wakefulness. Every muscle group activated in sequence before he moved toward the mine shaft entrance to investigate the new day's conditions. His keen senses would detect any changes in weather, any sounds that might indicate the presence of other travelers, any sense that could warn of potential dangers or opportunities. The radio provided a soundtrack of routine morning traffic as Jed monitored frequencies that would carry any discussion of missing persons or search operations, dispatcher chatter, road condition reports, and weather updates that confirmed what he could see through the mine shaft entrance. Clear skies and bitter cold temperatures that would make travel demanding, but not impossible. No mention of Jedediah Boone, no requests for welfare checks at remote ranch locations, no coordination of search efforts for elderly missing persons. Thomas and Carol were probably still sleeping, secure in their assumption that Uncle Jed was maintaining his normal routine despite their late-night planning session. They'd discover his absence eventually, but by then he'd be so deep in the wilderness that conventional search methods would prove useless. The high-altitude air carried sounds with crystalline clarity, every noise amplified and sharpened by the thin atmosphere and snow-covered surfaces that reflected rather than absorbed acoustic energy. A branch cracking under snow load 200 yards away sounded like a gunshot. Wind moving through pine needles created whispers that could be heard for miles. In this environment, silence was survival, and movement required constant attention. To noise discipline, Jed packed his gear with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that forgotten items couldn't be replaced, and poor organization could prove fatal during emergency situations. Every piece of equipment had its designated place in the duffel bag, packed in order of priority and accessibility. Emergency items on top, luxury goods at the bottom. Survival essentials distributed throughout for redundancy. The snowshoes that had served him well during the night's travel would be even more critical now, with deeper accumulation and unstable surface conditions that could trap an unwary traveler or send them tumbling down slopes that dropped into terrain where rescue was impossible. But Jed had spent years learning to read snow the way sailors read water, understanding its moods and dangers with the fluency that came from necessity rather than recreation. Bear waited patiently while his master completed the ritual of camp breakdown, ember eyes alert for any indication of their next destination. The dog had adapted quickly to their new reality, accepting the change from comfortable routine to challenging uncertainty with the philosophical resilience that animals brought to situations beyond their control. Humans agonized over decisions and consequences. Dogs simply adapted and endured. The mineshaft had served its purpose, providing shelter during the storm's worst fury and a base from which to begin the next phase of their journey. But it was also a known location, marked on maps that search teams would eventually consult when conventional efforts failed to locate the missing rancher. Time to move deeper into terrain that appeared on no tourist guides and offered sanctuary only to those who understood its secrets. The trail Jed followed now was older than the mining roads, created by Native American hunting parties who'd traveled these mountains for generations before European settlement changed everything. Narrow, steep and demanding, it switchbacked through terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers, following ridge lines and creek beds that offered the most efficient routes through landscape that had defeated countless travelers over the centuries. At 7,000 feet, the world opened into vast panoramas that stretched to horizons measured in geological time rather than human distance. Valley systems carved by glaciers millions of years ago, mountain ranges that rose like ancient monuments to forces beyond human comprehension. Skies so clear and blue, it seemed possible to see all the way to space itself. Bear moved with the easy rhythm of an animal perfectly adapted to high-altitude travel, his breathing steady despite the thin air that would challenge lowland creatures. German shepherds had been bred for endurance and environmental adaptation, characteristics that made them ideal companions for people whose lives involved extended travel through hostile terrain. The radio crackled with increasing frequency as morning brought more activity to the valley below. School buses checking road conditions, ranchers coordinating livestock feeding schedules, emergency services monitoring weather-related incidents. Normal life continuing in the civilized world that lay thousands of feet below and countless miles behind them in terms of accessibility and relevance. Still no mention of missing persons, no coordination of search efforts, no indication that anyone had yet discovered Jedediah Boone's absence from his normal routine. That would change eventually, probably within the next few hours when Thomas made his daily check of the ranch operations and found his uncle's cabin empty. But by then Jed would be so far into the wilderness that electronic communication became impossible and physical. Pursuit required resources that local law enforcement didn't possess. The landscape ahead stretched like a frozen ocean. Waves of white peaks extending beyond the range of vision into territory that few people had ever seen and fewer still had ever traveled. National forest land mostly, with occasional patches of private property that belonged to people who valued isolation more than convenience. Perfect country for someone who needed to disappear completely while maintaining access to the basic resources necessary for long-term survival. Water was abundant in the form of snow that could be melted, streams that ran year-round despite freezing temperatures, and natural springs that bubbled up from deep underground sources. Wildlife was plentiful for someone who understood hunting and trapping, with deer, elk, rabbits, and game birds that could provide protein for extended periods. Shelter could be constructed from materials available in any forested area, using techniques that had kept soldiers alive in environments where exposure meant death within hours. Food was the primary limitation, but Jed had planned for extended self-sufficiency with military rations that provided maximum nutrition per pound of weight. Properly rationed, his supplies would last 3 weeks without supplementation. Combined with hunting and foraging opportunities, he could sustain himself indefinitely in country that would challenge most people, even with full support and preparation. The temperature was dropping as they climbed higher. Altitude and clear skies combining to create conditions that could freeze exposed skin within minutes. But Jed had experienced worse, had operated in environments where cold was just another tactical factor to be considered and overcome. Proper clothing, steady movement, and constant attention to early warning signs of hypothermia or frostbite were all that stood between survival and death in conditions like these. Bear's thick coat provided natural insulation that made him comfortable in temperatures that would kill most domestic animals. But even he needed careful monitoring for signs of distress or overexertion. The dog's welfare was Jed's primary concern now, more important than his own comfort or safety. Bear represented the only relationship in his life that had proven immune to calculation, convenience, or self-interest. The trail ahead wound through terrain that grew progressively more challenging, demanding careful route selection and constant attention to changing conditions. Ice formed where snowmelt had refrozen, creating surfaces that could send an unwary traveler sliding hundreds of feet down slopes that ended in rocks sharp enough to kill. But Jed had navigated worse terrain under more dangerous circumstances, had learned to read mountain conditions with the fluency of someone whose life had depended on such knowledge. Behind them, the valley where he'd spent 47 years building something meaningful lay hidden beneath morning clouds that clung to the lower elevations like regret made visible. Somewhere down there, Thomas and Carol were beginning their day with the comfortable assumption that Uncle Jed would be available whenever they needed him, ready to provide labor or knowledge or simply presence that they valued only when it was absent. They'd learn differently soon enough. By afternoon, they'd discover that practical decisions about inconvenient relatives sometimes carried consequences that practical people hadn't anticipated. They'd realize that taking someone for granted was a luxury that ended the moment that person decided they deserved better treatment than livestock scheduled for disposal. The mountains ahead stretched like a promise of something better, not easier but more honest. Country where a man's worth was measured by his ability to survive and contribute, rather than his productivity relative to his maintenance costs. Territory where loyalty meant something because disloyalty could prove fatal. Where respect was earned through competence rather than demanded through family connection. Jedediah Boone was going home to a place he'd never lived but had always understood. The wilderness didn't care about his age, his productivity, or his convenience to others. It only cared about his ability to adapt, endure, and overcome whatever challenges it presented. That was a test he'd been preparing for his entire life, even during the years when he'd thought he was building something else entirely. By noon, the radio traffic had changed tenor in ways that confirmed Jed's expectations about discovery timing and family response patterns. Between routine dispatcher calls and weather updates, he caught fragments of conversation that told the story he'd anticipated. A missing person report filed by concerned relatives, initial inquiries about an elderly rancher who'd failed to maintain his normal schedule, requests for welfare checks that had revealed an empty cabin, and signs of departure. Thomas's voice came through clearly during one exchange with County Dispatch, strained with the particular anxiety that came from realizing you'd badly misjudged a situation and its potential consequences. "No, sir, no indication of medical emergency or foul play. His personal effects are gone, including military gear we didn't know he still had. It's like he just packed up and left in the middle of the night." The dispatcher's response reflected professional training designed to extract relevant information while avoiding speculation about motives or circumstances. Any recent arguments or disagreements that might have prompted departure. Financial problems, health concerns, family disputes. A long pause before Thomas answered, and Jed could imagine his nephew's internal struggle between honesty and self-preservation. There had been some discussions about his living arrangements. Nothing that seemed significant at the time, but maybe he overheard something he misunderstood. Jed almost smiled at the euphemism, as if 47 years of life experience had left him incapable of comprehending plain English spoken by people who'd assumed he was too old and isolated to notice their betrayal. The human capacity for self-deception never ceased to amaze him. Even after decades of observing it in various forms and circumstances, Bear had found a sunny spot sheltered from wind, where the snow depth allowed comfortable resting. His thick coat providing insulation against cold ground, while his dark coloring absorbed solar radiation that helped maintain body temperature. The dog's natural understanding of environmental factors impressed Jed constantly. Instincts, honed by thousands of years of evolution, that taught survival lessons no classroom could duplicate. The terrain they'd covered since dawn represented significant distance from the ranch, but more importantly, it had taken them into country where conventional search methods would prove ineffective. No roads, no marked trails, no obvious destinations that would attract official attention. Just wilderness that stretched for hundreds of square miles in every direction, offering countless hiding places for someone who understood how to use natural features as concealment. The topographical map spread across Jed's knees showed the complexity of the landscape ahead. Elevation changes measured in thousands of feet. Creek systems that carved deep canyons through solid rock. Forest cover dense enough to hide entire armies if they understood proper camouflage and movement discipline. Perfect country for people who needed to disappear while maintaining access to water, shelter, and the resources necessary for long-term survival. His current position placed them roughly 12 miles northwest of the ranch, following ridgelines that would be invisible from valley floors and accessible only to travelers on foot or horseback. The next waypoint lay another 8 miles ahead, where an abandoned Forest Service cabin offered potential shelter and a cache of supplies he'd established years earlier during hunting trips that had doubled as reconnaissance missions. The cabin had been built in the 1940s for fire lookouts, abandoned when modern technology made human observation posts obsolete, and forgotten by bureaucrats who measured forest management in budgets rather than boots on the ground. Jed had discovered it during a hunting trip 15 years ago, noted its strategic value, and quietly begun stocking it with supplies that might prove useful during emergencies. Canned goods with long shelf lives. Water purification tablets, medical supplies, batteries for electronic equipment, even ammunition for the rifles he'd cached there against the possibility that circumstances might require their use. Not illegal stockpiling, just prudent preparation by someone who understood that emergencies rarely announce themselves in advance, and help was often unavailable when you needed it most. The radio continued its background. Chatter as search coordination began in earnest. County Sheriff's Department coordinating with state agencies and volunteer groups that specialized in finding missing persons in wilderness areas. Professional, methodical, and ultimately doomed to failure because they were looking for an elderly rancher who might have become confused and wandered off. Not a former special operations soldier who'd left deliberately and with specific destinations in mind. Search teams will concentrate on the most likely areas first, the dispatcher was explaining to someone. Probably a coordinator from one of the volunteer organizations. Nearby towns, medical facilities, places where an elderly person might seek help during severe weather. If those don't produce results, we'll expand into the wilderness areas. But that's a massive undertaking, given the terrain. Massive undertaking was an understatement. The wilderness surrounding the ranch covered an area larger than some eastern states, with terrain that ranged from gentle valleys to peaks that challenged experienced mountaineers. Searching it thoroughly would require resources that local agencies didn't possess, and timeframes that made success increasingly unlikely with each passing hour. Bear lifted his head as a sound carried across the thin air. Helicopter rotors, still distant but growing closer. Probably an initial aerial survey, pilots trying to spot tracks or signs of recent passage in areas accessible to conventional search methods. Jed automatically assessed concealment options, identifying features that would hide them from aerial observation if the aircraft came close enough to pose a threat. The overhang they'd chosen for their rest stop provided natural camouflage, deep shadows that would hide heat signatures from thermal imaging, while rock formations broke up their outline from visual observation. But concealment was only effective if you understood its limitations and remained motionless when discovery was possible. The helicopter passed a mile to the south, following the main valley that contained the ranch and the most obvious escape routes for someone traveling on foot. Standard search pattern for missing persons cases, concentrating on areas where lost individuals typically traveled when confusion or panic overcame rational planning. They'd find nothing, of course, because Jedediah Boone wasn't lost and hadn't traveled any of the routes they'd expect an elderly rancher to follow. The aircraft's departure allowed them to resume movement, but the radio traffic had provided valuable intelligence about search efforts and official thinking regarding his disappearance. They were treating it as a potential medical emergency or confusion-related incident, not a deliberate departure by someone with specific plans and advanced preparation. That misunderstanding would work in his favor for several days, possibly weeks, before they realized their basic assumptions were wrong. The trail ahead climbed steadily through forest cover that provided concealment from aerial observation while offering numerous options for route changes if circumstances required deception or misdirection. Jed had planned multiple alternatives for every segment of their journey, understanding that flexibility was more important than rigid adherence to predetermined routes when operating in hostile territory. Bear moved with increasing confidence as they gained elevation, his natural adaptation to mountain conditions evident in steady breathing and sure footing on terrain that would challenge less hardy animals. The dog seemed to understand that they were heading towards something rather than simply fleeing from something, his alert posture indicating anticipation rather than anxiety about their ultimate destination. The afternoon sun created glare conditions that made long-distance visibility difficult, but provided warmth that helped offset the energy expenditure required for high-altitude travel. Jed adjusted their pace to match environmental factors, understanding that endurance was more important than speed when covering distances that would be measured in days rather than hours. The radio traffic continued to provide updates on search progress, most of it confirming what he'd expected: thorough coverage of obvious areas producing no results, growing coordination between agencies as the search expanded, and increasing concern about an elderly man's ability to survive exposure in conditions that had challenged younger, better-equipped individuals. "We've got teams checking every building within a 10-mile radius," someone was reporting. Probably a search coordinator updating headquarters about initial efforts. No sign of the subject at any of the usual locations. No hospitals have admitted anyone matching his description. No hotels or motels show recent registrations. And none of the neighbors have seen him since yesterday evening. The timeline confirmed that Thomas and Carol had discovered his absence roughly when he'd expected, probably during Thomas's routine check of ranch operations that afternoon. They'd likely spent several hours assuming he'd return on his own before accepting that something significant had happened and contacting authorities. Their delay in reporting his disappearance had given him additional time to put distance between himself and potential search efforts, but more importantly, It revealed something about their fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. They'd expected Uncle Jed to be available whenever convenience required, but hadn't considered that he might have his own plans and capabilities that operated independently of their assumptions. The trail ahead wound through terrain that grew progressively more challenging, requiring careful route selection and constant attention to environmental factors that could turn from advantage to liability without warning. But Jed had operated in worse conditions under more dangerous circumstances, had learned to read wilderness terrain with the fluency of someone whose survival had depended on such knowledge. Behind them, search teams were beginning the massive undertaking of looking for someone who didn't want to be found in country that offered 10,000 hiding places for every searcher they could deploy. Ahead lay territory that few people had ever seen and fewer still had ever traveled. Wilderness that would test his skills and endurance, but offer something more valuable than any comfort his family's ranch had provided: freedom. The kind that came from self-reliance rather than dependency, from respect earned through competence rather than granted through family connection, from relationships based on loyalty rather than convenience. Territory where Jedediah Boone could be himself rather than playing the role of Uncle Jed, useful when needed, and ignored when inconvenient. The mountains stretched ahead like a promise of something better, not easier, certainly, but more honest than the life he'd left behind in the valley below. Country where a man's worth was measured by his ability to contribute rather than his cost to maintain. Where respect was earned rather than demanded. Where loyalty meant something because its absence could prove fatal. Thomas and Carol could search for Uncle Jed as long as they wanted. They'd never find him, because that person had ceased to exist the moment he'd heard them planning his disposal. What remained was someone they'd never bothered to understand. Someone whose capabilities extended far beyond their imagination. Someone who just reminded them that taking people for granted was a luxury that ended when those people decided they deserved better treatment. The radio continued its chatter as search efforts expanded and coordination increased. But Jed was already beyond their reach, moving deeper into country where electronic communication became impossible and physical pursuit required resources that no local agency possessed. He was going home to a place he'd never lived but had always understood, where survival was the only test that mattered and everything else was just conversation. The Forest Service cabin appeared exactly where Jed's memory had placed it. A weathered structure that blended so perfectly with its surroundings that most people would walk past without noticing its existence. Built from local timber and designed for function rather than comfort, it had sheltered fire lookouts for 3 decades before budget cuts and technological advances made human observation posts obsolete. Bear approached the cabin with cautious interest, nostrils flaring as he processed scents that told stories Jed could only imagine. Previous occupants, recent visitors, wildlife that had sheltered here during storms, all of it registered in the dog's sophisticated olfactory database with the precision of a laboratory analysis. The door opened, easily despite 15 years of abandonment. Hinges that Jed had oiled during previous visits still functioning smoothly. Inside, dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight that slanted through windows, designed to provide maximum visibility across the valley below. The main room contained everything a fire lookout had needed: communication equipment, observation instruments, basic furniture built to last generations. But it was the basement that held Jed's real interest. A storage area that appeared empty to casual inspection, but contained resources he'd accumulated over years of careful preparation. Behind a false wall that looked like original construction, shelves held supplies that could sustain 2 travelers for months if rationed carefully. Military rations, water purification equipment, medical supplies, ammunition, communication gear, even winter clothing sized for his measurements. Everything a prudent man stockpiled against the possibility that circumstances might require extended self-sufficiency in hostile territory. Not paranoia, just preparation by someone who understood that emergencies rarely announce themselves in advance. The radio equipment was more sophisticated than anything he'd carried in his duffel bag. Military-grade transceivers capable of long-range communication on frequencies that weren't monitored by civilian agencies. Encrypted channels, burst transmission capability, and range sufficient to reach contacts across multiple states if circumstances required such. Communication.contacts, that was the word that had always troubled Thomas when he'd puzzled over his uncle's military possessions, unable to understand why a retired rancher would maintain equipment designed for covert communication. The answer was simple, but not one that Thomas could have comprehended even if Jed had explained it directly. Some brotherhoods transcended retirement. Some loyalties outlasted official service. Some skills were too valuable to waste, and some knowledge too important to abandon just because governments changed their minds about foreign policy or budget priorities. The men Jed had served with understood obligations that extended beyond official channels, responsibilities that didn't end when politicians decided certain operations had never happened. The radio crackled to life as he activated the main transceiver, scanning frequencies that carried traffic most people never imagined existed. Military channels, intelligence networks, private security firms, government contractors. A shadow world that operated parallel to civilian life but remained invisible to those who lacked proper access codes and authentication protocols. Shepherd Base. "This is Phantom 7, Jed spoke into the microphone, using call signs that hadn't been heard on these frequencies for 3 years, requesting status update and operational briefing. The response came immediately, confirming that someone had been monitoring these channels and waiting for contact from assets that might have seemed dormant, but were never truly inactive. Phantom 7 Shepherd Base. Authenticate with Delta 77. The authentication codes flowed automatically. Muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought and confirmed identity through knowledge that couldn't be faked or duplicated. Numbers, letters, and phrases that changed according to schedules memorized during training so intensive it bordered on brainwashing, designed to verify identity even when normal communication channels had been compromised. Authentication confirmed. Phantom 7, stand by for priority briefing. Bear settled beside the radio equipment with alert interest, sensing that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't understand the technical details. The dog's posture indicated readiness for action, preparation for whatever might come next in their increasingly complex situation. The voice that came through the speaker belonged to someone Jed recognized, though he hadn't heard it for 5 years. Colonel James Morrison, retired from official service, but still active in operations that required deniable assets and off-the-books capabilities. Morrison had recruited Jed originally, had trained him in skills that few people possessed, and had maintained contact even after official retirement. Phantom 7. We've been monitoring communications regarding your current situation. Family troubles, missing person reports, search operations in your area. Are you operating under duress, or is this a voluntary departure? The question revealed more than casual monitoring. Morrison's people had been tracking official radio traffic, analyzing patterns, and drawing conclusions about Jed's disappearance that went far beyond what local law enforcement suspected. They understood that Jedediah Boone wasn't a confused elderly man wandering in the wilderness, but an asset who'd chosen to activate protocols that most people didn't know existed. Voluntary departure, Jed confirmed. Family situation became untenable. Activated contingency plans for extended field operations. Understood. We have a situation that could benefit from your particular expertise if you're interested in resuming active status. High priority target, time-sensitive operation. Requires assets with your specific background and current positioning. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that would fundamentally change the nature of his departure from ranch life. What had begun as escape from family betrayal could become something larger, more significant, more dangerous than simple disappearance into wilderness anonymity. Nature of operation? Jed asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Morrison's people didn't activate dormant assets for routine assignments. Whatever they wanted required skills that few people possessed, and fewer still could apply in circumstances where official channels weren't available. Cartel operation moving through your area. Major distribution network, heavily armed, using remote locations to avoid law enforcement detection. Intelligence indicates they've established a processing facility somewhere in the wilderness northwest of your previous location. The wilderness northwest of the ranch. Exactly the direction Jed had been traveling, following routes that would take him deeper into territory where few people ventured and conventional law enforcement rarely operated. Country perfect for illegal operations that required isolation and security from official interference. Local law enforcement awareness? Jed inquired, though he suspected the answer would explain why Morrison's people were interested in unofficial solutions to official problems. Minimal. They're focused on legitimate business and don't have resources for extended wilderness operations. Federal agencies are aware but constrained by jurisdictional issues and political considerations. This is exactly the kind of situation where unofficial assets provide optimal solutions. Unofficial assets. The euphemism covered a multitude of activities that congressional oversight committees preferred not to examine too closely. Operations that achieved necessary results without creating paper trails that could embarrass politicians or compromise ongoing intelligence efforts. Jed had been such an asset for 15 years, accumulating experience in situations where success was measured by mission completion rather than legal compliance. Compensation and support, he asked, though money wasn't really the consideration. After 47 years of simple living, his needs were modest and his resources adequate. But operational support could make the difference between success and failure when working alone in hostile territory. Full contractor rates plus performance bonuses. Logistical support, intelligence updates, extraction if required. Standard package for assets of your classification. Standard package for someone with Jed's background meant resources that most people couldn't imagine. Satellite communication, real-time intelligence, air support if circumstances required, and compensation that reflected the unique value of his particular skills, applied to specific types of problems. Bear raised his head as movement outside caught his attention. Ears pricked forward in the alert posture that indicated something approaching their position. Jed automatically reached for the sidearm that rode in its familiar position. Fingers closing around grip worn smooth by decades of handling. Through the cabin windows, he could see 3 figures moving up the trail they'd followed. Dark shapes against snow that reflected afternoon sunlight with painful intensity. Not search and rescue. Their movement patterns were too coordinated, too purposeful, too professional for civilian volunteers looking for a missing rancher. Shepherd Base. I have movement on my position. 3 individuals approaching from the southeast. Movement discipline suggests military or law enforcement training. Negative on law enforcement. Phantom 7, our intelligence indicates cartel scouts conducting reconnaissance in that area. You may have inadvertently intercepted their operational security perimeter. Cartel scouts. Not family-organized search efforts or volunteer rescue teams, but advance elements from the same organization Morrison wanted him to target. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. Either Morrison's people had guided him toward this contact, or circumstances had aligned in ways that transformed his personal escape into professional opportunity. Rules of engagement? Jed asked, though his training provided default protocols for situations where hostile forces threatened operational security. Defensive initially. If they're conducting surveillance on our target area, we need intelligence before taking direct action. But protect yourself and your position. These people aren't known for their restraint when dealing with potential witnesses. The 3 figures had stopped approximately 200 yards from the cabin. taking positions that suggested reconnaissance rather than assault. They were observing, evaluating, trying to determine whether the structure was occupied and what threat level it might represent to their operations. Bear had gone absolutely still, every muscle tensed for action. The dog understood that danger was approaching, could sense the change in his master's energy and preparation for potential violence. This wasn't the casual alertness of wildlife observation, but the focused intensity that preceded life-or-death confrontation. Jed moved away from the windows, using furniture and structural elements to break up his outline, while maintaining observation of the approaching scouts. The Colt .45 felt comfortable in his hand, weight and balance as familiar as his own heartbeat. Some things you never forgot, no matter how many years passed between applications. Phantom 7, Morrison's voice crackled through the radio speaker. "We're tracking your situation via satellite. Recommend you neutralize the immediate threat and establish secure perimeter. Full briefing on primary target will follow once your position is secured. Neutralize the immediate threat." Military euphemism for killing people who pose danger to mission success, applied with the casual efficiency of someone ordering coffee rather than authorizing lethal force. But Morrison was right. These weren't casual hikers who'd stumbled across his location by accident. They were advance elements of an organization that killed witnesses as routinely as most people discarded trash. The plot twist wasn't that Jed had stumbled into a cartel operation during his escape from family betrayal. The twist was that his family's betrayal had freed him to become something he'd set aside decades ago. A weapon pointed at enemies who threatened innocent people. An asset whose capabilities were perfectly suited to problems that conventional law enforcement couldn't solve. Uncle Jed would have tried to hide, would have hoped the scouts would pass by without discovering his presence, would have prioritized avoiding confrontation over accepting necessary risks. But Jedediah Boone understood that some situations required direct action, that some enemies deserved exactly what they had coming, and that some missions were worth the danger they entailed. Thomas and Carol had wanted to dispose of a burden. Instead, they'd liberated something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, a man whose loyalty had been the only thing restraining skills that few people possessed, and even fewer had ever been trained to use against enemies who deserved no mercy. The transformation was complete. Uncle Jed was gone forever, disappeared into a snowstorm that had erased all evidence of his existence. What remained was Jedediah Boone, and these cartel scouts were about to discover why that name had once been whispered with fear in places where very bad people did very bad things to innocent civilians. Bear's low growl confirmed what Jed already knew. The time for hiding was over. The time for action had begun. The three scouts had taken positions that revealed professional training and tactical awareness. They weren't random criminals stumbling through the wilderness, but organized advance elements conducting systematic reconnaissance with the discipline of military professionals. Their spacing, movement patterns, and communication protocols indicated experience with operations where mistakes proved fatal, and success required careful planning. Jed observed them through binoculars that had served him well in environments where accurate intelligence meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The lead scout was communicating with someone via radio, probably reporting their discovery of the cabin and requesting instructions from higher authority. Standard procedure for reconnaissance elements operating in unfamiliar territory. Shepherd Base, Jed whispered into his microphone, maintaining communication protocols that had kept him alive. Through 15 years of operations, most people never imagined. Scout element appears to be establishing Overwatch position. Recommend immediate intelligence briefing on primary target location and operational structure. Morrison's response came immediately, confirming that satellite surveillance was providing real-time intelligence to support field operations. Phantom 7, primary target is located approximately 6 miles northwest of your position. Processing facility built into abandoned mining complex. Estimated 30 to 40 personnel. Heavy weapons and sophisticated security measures. 30 to 40 personnel. That was a significant force, larger than most military units, and certainly more than local law enforcement could handle even with federal support. These weren't street dealers or casual smugglers, but a major distribution network with resources that probably exceeded those of some small countries. Intel indicates they've been using your current location as an observation post, Morrison continued. The cabin provides excellent sightlines to approach routes from the southeast, which is why they're interested in maintaining control of that position. That explained the scouts' interest in the cabin beyond simple reconnaissance. They needed the location for their own security operations, which meant they wouldn't simply observe and withdraw. They'd either attempt to establish permanent occupancy or eliminate anyone who might interfere with their surveillance requirements. Bear had positioned himself near the cabin's rear exit, ember eyes fixed on the approaching threats with intensity that reflected his understanding of the situation's seriousness. The dog's military training had been limited to basic commands and loyalty exercises, but his natural intelligence and pack instincts made him an invaluable partner in situations where human capabilities needed canine enhancement. The radio crackled as Morrison provided additional intelligence that painted a picture of sophisticated criminal operations that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. Secondary intelligence indicates weapons trafficking, human smuggling, and money laundering operations. These people represent a significant threat to regional security, and local authorities lack resources for effective interdiction, weapons trafficking, and human smuggling. That elevated the threat level beyond anything Jed had encountered during his ranching years, placing this operation in the category of missions that had once required his specialized skills and unconventional approach to problem-solving. The kind of enemies who deserved exactly what professional soldiers were trained to deliver. Equipment and logistics status? Jed asked, mentally calculating resources required for operations against targets of this size and sophistication. His cached supplies were adequate for extended independent operations, but engaging 30 to 40 hostiles would require careful planning and possibly external support. Full contractor package authorized, Morrison confirmed. Additional equipment drops available on request, air support on standby, extraction available if mission parameters change. You have complete operational autonomy and unlimited resources for mission completion. Unlimited resources meant Morrison's people considered this operation significant enough to warrant maximum investment in success. Whatever these cartels were doing in the wilderness northwest of the ranch posed threats that justified activating dormant assets and providing support that most government agencies couldn't access through normal channels. The key lead scout was moving closer now, approaching the cabin with the careful attention to concealment and route selection that marked professional military training. His weapon was ready but not threatening, suggesting reconnaissance rather than immediate assault intentions. Standard procedure for establishing security perimeters around unknown locations. Jed moved to a position that provided optimal fields of fire while maintaining concealment from external observation. The cabin's construction offered excellent defensive advantages. Thick log walls that would stop small arms fire, multiple exit routes, and interior layout that minimized exposure to hostile fire from outside positions. The Randall knife felt comfortable in his left hand, while the Colt .45 occupied his right. Combination of tools that had served him well in situations where close-quarters combat became inevitable. Some problems required bullets, others needed blade work, and experience had taught him to prepare for both possibilities simultaneously. Phantom 7. Morrison's voice carried new urgency. Satellite intel shows additional movement on your position. Estimate 12 to 15 personnel approaching from multiple directions. This appears to be a coordinated security sweep rather than casual reconnaissance. 12 to 15 personnel represented a significant escalation from the original 3 scouts, suggesting that Jed's presence had triggered alarm protocols that brought serious firepower to bear on his position. These people didn't take chances with potential witnesses or security threats, which meant negotiation wasn't among the available options. Bear's low growl confirmed what the radio traffic had indicated. More enemies were approaching from directions not visible through the cabin's front windows. The dog's acute hearing had detected movement that human senses couldn't perceive, providing early warning that might prove critical for survival during the next few minutes. Rules of engagement are weapons-free, Morrison announced, using terminology that authorized lethal force without requiring specific permission for each engagement. These targets are designated hostile combatants operating in violation of federal law on American soil. Neutralize all threats using whatever methods you consider appropriate. Weapons-free meant Jedediah Boone was officially back in business, authorized to apply skills that had remained dormant for nearly 5 decades but had never actually deteriorated. Muscle memory for violence, tactical awareness that operated below conscious thought, and the particular mindset required for surviving situations where hesitation meant death. The transformation was complete now, triggered not by family betrayal, but by circumstances that demanded his return to professional competence he'd set aside but never abandoned. Uncle Jed was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that certain enemies deserved exactly what they had coming, and that some problems required solutions that civilian authorities couldn't provide. "Bear," he said quietly, and the dog immediately moved to the designated position they'd practiced during countless training sessions over the years. Not military training, exactly, but ranch work that had required coordination between man and animal in situations where livestock could become dangerous and careful. Teamwork was essential for safety. The first scout was close enough now for Jed to see details that confirmed his assessment of professional training and serious intent. Military-style clothing, quality equipment, weapons handling that suggested familiarity with violence rather than casual criminality. These weren't street dealers or amateur smugglers, but professional soldiers working for organizations that operated with military discipline and resources. Through the rear window, he could see movement that indicated the security sweep was proceeding according to plan, with multiple elements approaching from different directions to establish complete coverage of the target area. Standard military tactics applied to civilian law enforcement situations, suggesting that these people had access to training and leadership that exceeded anything local authorities were prepared to handle. The radio crackled with intelligence updates that painted an increasingly complex picture of criminal operations that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. Phantom 7, additional intel indicates this organization has been responsible for 17 missing persons cases in this region over the past 2 years. Local and federal authorities have been unable to develop actionable intelligence due to operational security measures and geographic isolation. 17 missing persons. That elevated this beyond criminal enterprise into something approaching terrorism, systematic elimination of witnesses and threats that demonstrated complete disregard for human life and legal consequences. The kind of enemies that justified maximum response and minimum restraint when opportunity for direct action presented itself. Jed checked his ammunition load and confirmed the positions of backup weapons he'd placed around the cabin. During his initial reconnaissance, every angle covered, every possible approach route monitored, every defensive advantage maximized through positioning and preparation that drew on decades of experience in situations where planning determined survival. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, creating lighting conditions that would favor defenders over attackers for approximately 2 hours before darkness changed tactical advantages. Time enough to resolve the immediate threat and establish secure perimeter for whatever came next in this unexpectedly complex situation. Bear was watching him with the alert attention that indicated readiness for action, waiting for commands that would initiate coordinated response to threats approaching their position. The dog understood that violence was imminent, could sense the change in his master's energy that preceded the application of deadly force to appropriate targets. Shepherd Base. Jed spoke quietly into the microphone. Recommend immediate satellite surveillance on approach routes and communication intercept on hostile frequencies. I need real-time intelligence on their coordination and command structure. Confirmed, Phantom 7. Full surveillance package activated. You have priority intelligence support and unlimited operational authority. Neutralize all threats and secure the position for follow-on operations against the primary target. The moment of truth was approaching, triggered not by his family's betrayal, but by circumstances that demanded his return to skills he'd hoped never to use again. Thomas and Carol had wanted to dispose of a burden, but they'd actually liberated something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, a weapon that had been pointed at America's enemies for 15 years and was about to remind certain people why Jedediah Boone had once been feared in places where very bad things happened to people who threatened innocent civilians. The first scout was close enough now to engage, and the others were moving into positions that would soon eliminate any possibility of avoiding confrontation. Time for talking was over. Time for action had begun, and after 47 years of building things, Jedediah Boone was about to remember why he'd been so good at destroying them when circumstances required such destruction. The first shot came at 4:17 p.m., announced by the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle that shattered the afternoon silence and sent splinters flying from the cabin's doorframe. The scout had decided that reconnaissance was complete and direct action was the appropriate next step, a tactical error that revealed impatience rather than professional discipline. Jed was already moving before the sound finished echoing off the surrounding peaks. Muscle memory taking control as conscious thought shifted into the background where it belonged during lethal encounters. The Colt 45 tracked toward the muzzle flash with mechanical precision. Sight picture acquired and trigger squeeze initiated in one fluid motion that bridged 47 years of peaceful ranch life. The scout dropped with the boneless finality that marked center mass hits from weapons designed to stop threats permanently rather than wound them temporarily. No dramatic death scene, no final words or gestures, just the immediate transition from armed threat to motionless obstacle that experienced soldiers learned to expect rather than dramatize. Bear launched himself through the cabin's rear exit as the first shot was fired, executing the flanking maneuver they'd practiced during countless ranch scenarios that had prepared them both for situations requiring coordinated response to multiple threats. The dog's natural speed and stealth made him invaluable for disrupting enemy positions, while Jed engaged primary targets from defensive cover. Phantom 7. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio speaker. Satellite shows hostile forces converging on your position from 3 directions. Estimate 8 remaining personnel, armed with automatic weapons and moving with military coordination. 8 remaining personnel. The numbers were manageable for someone with Jed's training and positioning, but they represented serious firepower that could overwhelm defensive positions through volume of fire rather than tactical superiority. Time to demonstrate why Special Operations soldiers spent years learning to defeat larger forces through superior technique and battlefield awareness. The second shot missed his position by inches, the bullet gouging chunks of wood from the log wall beside his head. Poor marksmanship under stress, suggesting that these enemies relied more on intimidation and numerical advantage than individual competence with weapons. That was an exploitable weakness in the hands of someone who understood how to turn their strength against them. Jed's return fire was deliberate and accurate, each shot placed with the precision that came from understanding that ammunition was finite and targets needed to be neutralized efficiently rather than suppressed temporarily. The second scout stumbled backward with a red flower blooming across his chest. Weapon dropping from nerveless fingers as involuntary, muscle spasms ended his participation in the engagement movement to his left, caught his peripheral vision, a third figure attempting to flank his position using the natural cover provided by the cabin's foundation and surrounding vegetation. Standard small unit tactics applied by someone who understood fire and maneuver. Principles, but lacked the experience to execute them. Effectively against a prepared defender, the Randall knife flew with the accuracy that came from decades of practice and muscle. Memory that operated independent of conscious thought. 7 inches of razor-sharp steel found its target with surgical precision, ending the flanking attempt and reducing the immediate threat level to something more manageable for a single defender. Bear's distinctive bark echoed from somewhere behind the advancing enemies, indicating that the dog had successfully positioned himself to disrupt their coordination from an unexpected direction. German Shepherds were natural pack hunters with instincts that made them excellent partners for human predators who understood how to coordinate attacks from multiple angles. The radio provided real-time intelligence that confirmed what Jed's tactical assessment had suggested. The remaining enemies were regrouping for a coordinated assault rather than maintaining the individual initiative that had cost them 3 personnel. In the opening minutes of engagement, Phantom 7, hostiles are consolidating positions approximately 50 meters southeast of your location. Recommend aggressive action before they can organize. Effective fire support. Aggressive action meant abandoning defensive positions and taking the fight to enemies who expected him to remain stationary while they maneuvered for advantage. Counterintuitive for most people, but standard operating procedure. For special operations personnel who understood that initiative was more valuable than cover when facing numerically superior forces. Jed moved through the cabin's interior with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd memorized every obstacle and opportunity. During his initial reconnaissance, the rear exit provided concealment while he transitioned from defensive to offensive operations, closing distance to ranges where superior marksmanship and close-quarters combat skills provided maximum advantage. The 4th enemy died without knowing what had killed him. Jed's approach silent enough to avoid detection until the Colt's muzzle pressed against the base of his skull and delivered a message that required no translation. The suppressed weapons report was barely louder than a dry branch snapping, insufficient to alert his companions, who were focused on the cabin rather than their own security. Bear appeared beside him with the ghostly silence that had made German Shepherds valuable assets for reconnaissance and infiltration missions throughout military history. The dog's amber eyes reflected understanding that transcended species barriers, tactical awareness that operated on instinctive rather than intellectual levels, but achieved results that rivaled human planning. The remaining enemies had established a firing line that provided mutual support while concentrating firepower on the cabin's most vulnerable approaches. Good tactics executed with professional competence, but based on the assumption that their target remained in defensive positions rather than hunting them with the patience and skill that came from years of experience in situations where hunting meant survival. Movement discipline became critical now, with multiple enemies maintaining overlapping fields of observation that could detect careless approach or inadequate concealment. But Jed had learned such discipline in environments where detection meant death rather than tactical disadvantage, where patience was more important than speed and precision mattered more than aggression. The 5th enemy presented a perfect silhouette against snow that reflected afternoon sunlight with painful intensity. Range was less than 30 meters. Target acquisition was instantaneous, and the shot placement was textbook center mass with follow-up rounds delivered before the first had finished its work. No unnecessary risks, no dramatic gestures, just professional competence applied to appropriate targets. Phantom 7. Morrison's voice carried new urgency. Additional movement detected on satellite. Estimate 12 to 15 personnel approaching your position from the northeast. ETA approximately 10 minutes. This appears to be their main force responding to contact. Reports. 12 to 15 additional. Personnel meant the engagement was escalating, beyond what local resources could handle, even with his specialized capabilities. Time to consider extraction options and mission parameter changes that might require strategic withdrawal rather than tactical victory through direct confrontation. But extraction meant abandoning the cabin and cached supplies that represented months of preparation, surrendering tactical advantages that might prove critical for follow-on operations against the primary target. Sometimes the best course of action required accepting additional risk rather than seeking immediate safety through withdrawal. Negative on extraction, Jed responded. Request immediate air support and additional intelligence on approach routes. I can hold this position indefinitely if properly supported. Bear's low growl indicated that more enemies were approaching from directions not covered by his current field of observation. The dog's acute senses provided early warning that extended human capabilities, detecting threats that might otherwise achieve tactical surprise through superior numbers or coordinated movement. The 6th and 7th enemies died within seconds of each other, caught in a crossfire that demonstrated the value of coordinated action between human and animal partners who'd learned to function as an integrated team. No wasted motion, no unnecessary ammunition expenditure, just efficient application of lethal force to appropriate targets. The radio crackled with updates that painted an increasingly complex tactical picture requiring decisions about mission, priorities and resource allocation. 3 enemies remained from the original force, 12 to 15 approaching as reinforcements, and air support still minutes away from providing effective assistance. Time for the kind of tactical decision that separated special operations personnel from conventional forces, accepting higher risk in pursuit of mission objectives that justified such risk, demonstrating the competence that had made Jedediah Boone valuable to people who dealt with problems civilian authorities couldn't solve. The afternoon sun continued its descent toward the western peaks, creating shadows that would soon provide additional concealment opportunities while changing visibility conditions that could favor either attackers or defenders. Depending on positioning and tactical awareness, the air support arrived as the sun touched the western peaks, announced by the distinctive rhythm of rotors that had provided salvation for countless soldiers in situations where conventional rescue was impossible. Not a standard military helicopter, but civilian aircraft modified for operations that required deniability and equipment that couldn't be traced to official sources. Phantom 7. This is Guardian Angel. The pilot's voice carried the professional calm that marked aviators who'd flown missions in places where governments preferred to maintain plausible deniability. I have visual on your position and multiple hostiles approaching from the northeast. Request immediate target designation and rules of engagement. Jed had established overwatch position on the cabin's roof, using natural concealment and elevated perspective to coordinate the final phase of an engagement that would determine whether his mission continued or ended in the kind of failure that justified the resources Morrison's people had invested in reactivating dormant assets. Guardian Angel. Designate targets approaching from grid reference 347892. Estimate 15 personnel with automatic weapons. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. These are confirmed hostile combatants with no civilian presence in the area. The helicopter's response was immediate and devastating. Door-mounted weapon systems engaging targets with precision that reflected years of experience in environments where collateral damage was unacceptable and mission success required. Surgical application of overwhelming firepower. Muzzle flashes strobed against gathering darkness as 7.62mm rounds found their intended recipients. Bear had taken position beside him, amber eyes tracking movement below, while his acute hearing monitored approaches that might escape human detection. The dog's natural pack-hunting instincts made him invaluable for coordinating attacks from multiple directions, understanding tactical concepts that operated on instinctive rather than intellectual levels. The remaining 3 enemies from the original group had gone to ground when air support arrived, recognizing that their mission parameters had changed from assault to survival. Smart tactical decision, but ultimately futile when facing coordination between ground and air assets that understood how to eliminate threats through systematic application of superior firepower. Phantom 7. Morrison's voice carried satisfaction that confirmed successful mission completion. Satellite shows all hostile movement has ceased. Guardian Angel reports 15 confirmed kills, with no survivors attempting to withdraw. You are clear to proceed with secondary objectives. Secondary objectives meant transitioning from defensive operations to offensive action against the primary target, the processing facility that represented the real threat to regional security. 30 to 40 additional personnel, sophisticated defenses, and resources that would require careful planning rather than reactive engagement. Jed climbed down from the cabin roof as Guardian Angel departed for refueling and resupply, leaving behind a tactical situation that had been transformed from defensive engagement to secure base for follow-on operations. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the larger mission was just beginning. The radio equipment provided detailed intelligence briefings that painted a comprehensive picture of criminal operations extending far beyond anything local authorities had imagined. Primary target is fortified mining complex approximately 6 kilometers northwest of your position. Intelligence indicates weapons manufacturing, drug processing, and human trafficking operations with connections to international criminal organizations. Weapons manufacturing elevated the threat level beyond simple drug trafficking into territory that justified maximum response from assets trained to handle problems that conventional law enforcement couldn't address through normal channels. The kind of mission that had made Jedediah Boone valuable to people who operated in shadows deeper than public acknowledgement. Bear moved beside him as they prepared for movement toward the primary objective, the dog's readiness evident in alert posture and focused attention on his master's preparations. 47 years of partnership had created understanding that transcended species barriers, tactical coordination that operated through instinct rather than verbal communication. The duffel bag had been supplemented with additional equipment delivered by Guardian Angel, military-grade explosives and specialized weapons that reflected Morrison's assessment of threats they would encounter at the primary target. Not standard infantry equipment, but tools designed for operators who needed to neutralize sophisticated defenses through unconventional methods. Phantom 7. Morrison's final briefing carried the weight of authorization for operations that would exceed anything Jed had undertaken during his original military service. You have complete operational autonomy and unlimited authority for mission completion. These targets represent clear and present danger to national security, and their elimination is authorized under provisions that don't require congressional oversight. Unlimited authority meant Jedediah Boone was officially back in business, operating under protocols that had been established for situations where conventional law enforcement was inadequate and extraordinary measures were justified by extraordinary threats. The kind of authorization that had once made him feared in places where very bad people did very bad things to innocent civilians. The sun had disappeared behind the western peaks now, leaving behind the kind of mountain darkness that provided natural concealment for operations requiring stealth and surprise. Perfect conditions for someone who understood how to use environmental factors as tactical advantages rather than obstacles to mission completion. Thomas and Carol had thought they were disposing of a burden, an aging relative who'd outlived his usefulness and become inconvenient to their plans for prosperity. Instead, they'd liberated something far more dangerous than they could have imagined, a weapon that had been aimed at America's enemies for 15 years and was about to remind certain people why that name had once been whispered with fear. The immediate battle was over, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, 30 to 40 enemies were about to discover why underestimating Jedediah Boone had always been a fatal mistake. Even when he'd chosen to let people make that mistake safely, the transformation was complete. Uncle Jed was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that certain enemies deserved exactly what they had coming, and that some problems required solutions that only very special people could provide. Bear's low growl confirmed what Jed already knew. They were moving into territory where survival would depend on skills that had remained dormant for nearly 5 decades, but had never actually deteriorated. Time to finish what others had started. Time to remind certain people that some old soldiers never stopped being soldiers. The mission continued. 3 weeks later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone Ranch as Thomas walked slowly through the empty cabin that had once been his uncle's home. The search had been called off after 14 days, when every conventional method had failed to produce even a trace of the missing rancher who'd simply vanished into a winter storm. The official report would list Jedediah Boone as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure during severe weather conditions. A reasonable conclusion based on available evidence. An elderly man who'd left his cabin during a blizzard and disappeared into wilderness that had claimed younger, better-equipped victims over the years. But Thomas knew better now. The military equipment that investigators had found suggested capabilities none of them had imagined Uncle Jed possessed. The communication gear, the weapons, the maps marked with routes that led deep into territory, where few people ever traveled, evidence of a man who'd planned his departure with precision that exceeded anything a confused elderly person could have managed. Carol stood in the cabin's doorway, her expression reflecting the uncomfortable realization that their practical decision had carried consequences none of them had anticipated. "The children keep asking when Uncle Jed is coming home," she said quietly. "I don't know what to tell them anymore, the children." Thomas had forgotten how much his kids had loved their great-uncle, how many hours he'd spent teaching them about horses and cattle, and the kind of life lessons you couldn't learn in classrooms. Stories about loyalty, responsibility, and the importance of treating family like something more valuable than livestock to be managed for maximum efficiency. "We'll tell them he found somewhere better," Thomas replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Somewhere he could be happy. The news reports had provided fragments of a larger story that Thomas was only beginning to understand. A major cartel operation discovered and eliminated in the mountains northwest of their ranch. Sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been responsible for dozens of missing persons cases over the past 2 years. No details about how law enforcement had located the facility or what methods had been used to neutralize the threat. But the timing was interesting. The cartel operation had been destroyed 3 days after Uncle Jed's disappearance, eliminated so thoroughly that investigators found no survivors and evidence suggesting professional military action rather than conventional law enforcement techniques. Explosives, precision marksmanship, and tactical coordination that exceeded anything local agencies could have provided, Morrison's voice carried, through the satellite phone with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed successful mission completion by assets whose capabilities exceeded official expectations. Operation concluded with complete success. Phantom 7, primary and secondary targets eliminated, no survivors. No evidence connecting the action to official channels. Jed stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where he'd spent 47 years building something beautiful. Bear beside him as they watched the sun climb toward its zenith. Above peaks, that had witnessed his transformation from damaged soldier to accomplished rancher to something else entirely. The radio crackled with final coordination details that would close one chapter of his life while opening another. Compensation has been transferred to specified accounts, Morrison continued. New identity documents are complete, and relocation support is available whenever you're ready to establish permanent residence. The organization has additional missions that could benefit from your particular expertise if you're interested in maintaining active status. Active status. After 3 weeks of remembering what he'd been before Uncle Jed had existed, the offer held appeal that surprised him with its intensity. The satisfaction of completing missions that mattered, of protecting innocent people from threats that conventional authorities couldn't handle, of being valued for capabilities rather than tolerated despite inconvenience. But there were other considerations now. Bear had adapted well to their nomadic existence, but the dog was getting older and deserved stability rather than constant movement between operations that might require his master's extended absence. And Jed himself had learned something important during the mission. He was still capable of being the man Samuel and Martha had believed he could become. But that man didn't require family validation to prove his worth. Negative on additional missions, Jed responded after careful consideration. Recommend placing asset status on reserve? I have obligations here that require attention. Obligations. Bear's welfare was certainly one of them. But there were others that had emerged during quiet hours when the mission was complete and reflection was possible. Thomas and Carol had made their choice based on incomplete understanding, but their children deserved better than losing the only family member who'd ever taught them that worth was measured by character rather than productivity. The satellite phone provided one final exchange that would determine how this story ended, with continued isolation or with something that might resemble redemption for mistakes made by people who'd never understood what they were. Rejecting Phantom 7, Morrison said, with the tone of someone who'd worked with exceptional assets long enough to understand their motivations. Your family has been making inquiries about your status through official channels. They seem genuinely concerned about your welfare rather than simply resolving legal complications related to your disappearance. Genuinely concerned. Thomas and Carol had spent 2 weeks dealing with investigators, search teams, and bureaucratic complications that arose when family members vanished without explanation. But according to Morrison's intelligence, their concern had evolved beyond simple inconvenience into something that might actually resemble the worry appropriate for missing relatives. What kind of inquiries? Jed asked, though he suspected the answer would determine whether Uncle Jed remained permanently dead or might be resurrected under circumstances that protected everyone's interests. They've retained private investigators to continue searching. When official efforts were suspended, significant financial investment, emotional commitment that suggests genuine regret about circumstances preceding your departure. Intelligence indicates they've realized their error and would welcome your return under any conditions you considered acceptable. Bear raised his head as movement in the valley below caught his attention. Vehicles approaching the ranch in a convoy that suggested official business rather than casual visitors. Probably investigators returning for follow-up interviews. Or perhaps the private detectives Thomas and Carol had hired to continue searching for a man who was watching them from a ridge they'd never think to check. The irony wasn't lost on him. His family's practical decision to dispose of an inconvenient burden had freed him to become something they'd never imagined, had reminded him of capabilities that didn't require their validation or appreciation. But it had also taught them the value of something they'd taken for granted until it was no longer available. Shepherd Base, Jed said, after watching the vehicles disappear into the ranch complex below. Recommend monitoring family communications for 24 hours. If their concern appears genuine and they demonstrate appropriate respect for changed circumstances, I may consider limited contact to resolve their uncertainty about my status. understood. Phantom 7, full surveillance package authorized. Will provide complete intelligence briefing on their motivations and commitments before you make final decisions about re-establishing contact. The sun was climbing toward its zenith now, warming air that had been bitter cold during the pre-dawn hours when they'd completed their observation of the valley below. Perfect weather for new beginnings, fresh starts, and relationships that might be rebuilt on foundations more solid than shared genetics and inheritance expectations. Bear stretched in the morning sunshine, his thick coat absorbing solar radiation, while amber eyes remained alert for any changes in their environment. The dog understood that significant decisions were being made, could sense the contemplative energy that surrounded his master's evaluation of possibilities that hadn't existed a month ago. Thomas and Carol had wanted to warehouse Uncle Jed like obsolete equipment. Instead, they discovered that some people were more valuable than they'd bothered to understand, and that taking loyalty for granted was a luxury that ended when loyal people decided they deserved better treatment than burdensome livestock. Maybe they'd learned enough to justify giving them another chance. Maybe their children deserved the opportunity to know their great-uncle as someone more complex than the simple rancher they'd assumed he'd always been. Maybe there was still something worth building in the valley below, something that honored Samuel and Martha's memory while creating new possibilities for the future. The radio crackled one final time as Morrison provided the intelligence that would determine how this story ended. Phantom 7 intercept indicates genuine remorse and commitment to changed relationship dynamics. Your nephew has told investigators that he'd give anything to have another chance to show proper respect for family who'd earned it through decades of service. Proper respect for family who'd earned it. That was language Uncle Jed had never heard from Thomas, words that suggested understanding had emerged from loss and regret had taught lessons that prosperity couldn't provide. Maybe it was time to find out whether people could change when circumstances taught them the true cost of their assumptions. Jedediah Boone began walking down the mountain toward the valley below, Bear beside him as they headed for a reunion that would surprise some people and teach others that disappearing was easier than most folks imagined. But coming home required courage that few people possessed when they'd learned what they were truly capable of achieving on their own.